Welcome back to the Pilgrim Faith Podcast, where human wonder fuels the quest for Christian wisdom. I am joined once again by my good brother and co-host, Dr. Joseph Minnick. And today we have the very special privilege of speaking with Christiana Hale about her new book, Deeper Heaven, A Reader's Guide to C.S. Lewis's Ransom Trilogy. For our regular listeners, you'll know that C.S. Lewis holds a very dear part of our hearts, and he's an important conversation partner that we tend to talk about basically every single week in some fashion or another. Christiana is a teacher at the Logos School in Moscow, Idaho. She teaches Latin and English. She's obviously an author. She writes fiction, nonfiction, and some poetry. So Christiana, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Yes.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
So I guess one way we could start to get into a conversation is by talking about the title. So Deeper Heaven, you're sort of riffing off of C.S. Lewis's chapter in That Hideous Strength. He brought deeper heaven down on their heads.
Yeah.
And you use that to sort of jump off and talk to us about Lewis's understanding of space and why that space trilogy, as the Ransom trilogy has become known, would really be repulsive to Lewis, because space sort of marks out something cold and dead and lifeless, whereas heaven actually gets more to what Lewis would have thought about the cosmos. So talk to us a little bit about that first, about Lewis's understanding of medieval cosmology and how he views the cosmos and the heavens, and then we'll get into more of your commentary on the trilogy.
Yeah, so I remember one of the first things I noticed reading the trilogy through the first time was at the very end of Out of the Silent Planet. Ransom himself is writing, I think he's corresponding with Lewis, the character, right? So Lewis kind of puts himself as a character in the series as a kind of a historian, right? He's heard all these stories from Ransom, which he even mentions that Ransom is a pseudonym, right? So to protect the names of the real people, which is kind of a fun little element that he plays off of, which I think people kind of forget because we just come to know Ransom as Ransom. But Lewis is trying to make us feel like, oh, these are things that really happened or could have happened. And he says something specific about the idea of the heavens being the primary point that he would like people to take away from the story, right? That we would move back to that older conception, that we wouldn't really see it as empty space anymore. And I think it's quite amusing that with that being very, very obvious in the end of the first book, that we still call it the space trilogy, which I think probably Lewis thinks it's funny too. He wasn't really a too stick in the mud about that sort of thing. So he'd probably be like, it's fine, So I don't get mad at people when they call it the space trilogy, but I think it is funny to note that is kind of the point that he's trying to make. And he even says that later in a letter to someone points out that shift that happens. And he says, I'm glad you pointed that out. That is one of my favorite things about the Ransom trilogy is this shift in trying to recover this view of the heavens as opposed to space. And it's primarily an imaginative and an emotional, you might even say spiritual kind of view of creation. Less, he wouldn't say we have to unlearn everything we've discovered about the actual formation of, the order of the planets, or that we've sent men into space and they haven't run into this glass sphere. And we know that that's not actually the material layout, if you will, of the cosmos, but it's how we view the cosmos in relation to the creator and the rest of creation, and fitting a biblical worldview, fitting it into a biblical worldview as well. What does the Bible say about the heavens and the way they actually work? And so I think, that's what he's primarily interested in when it comes to utilizing the medieval cosmology. He even says in The Discarded Image, he says, these are all great things. The problem is it's not actually true, right? This is amazing, but it's not actually true. So yeah, I think he's playing around with ways that we can actually utilize that older view of things in a really vibrant and creative way.
Yeah, I kind of wonder, I was just teaching with some folks last week and discussing the discarded image. And one wonders if part of what's going on in the space trilogy is, he uses this metaphor that the medieval saints looked up to the heavens and they saw a cathedral and they didn't have that sense of claustrophobia. So they didn't feel like, that vast cosmic sea, punctuated by little dots. Mm-hmm. Rather, the space is sort of full. And that seems to be part of the imaginative shift. In fact, I hadn't read that. I hadn't read Out of the Silent Planet for, my goodness, it must have been 25 years almost until I was going to do this interview. So I was like, I'll pop it open again. And that paragraph you describe in the book is really the most important paragraph in the trilogy. Really struck me because it still fits even fits in a modern cosmology, in that light, in a sense, if you could imagine yourself in a spaceship, in the middle of space, you would still see a sky that's full of light. That's still the starlight in that. And so and he wants to almost kind of say there's a fullness. Yeah, there's a kind of pulsating fullness there. And one wonders is, and maybe I'm asking for a comment if you think Lewis would take it this direction, it's as though perhaps the gesture is to say that in modern cosmology, we should less think of the cathedral as gotten rid of, as rather expanded. It's like that maybe one way to look at within the new cosmology, to sort of appropriate the discarded image in a new cosmology, is to say that to whatever extent the cosmos expands in our scientific imagination, precisely to that extent, it's just the cathedral getting bigger. Does that work, do you think, with Lewis's?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, he uses our modern arrangement in the Ransom trilogy. So there is this scene where in Out of the Silent Planet, where he comes across one of the creatures, the Fiffletrig. He's carving out an image of the cosmos, and he mentions the order that he's doing the planets in, and it's not the medieval order, which is very interesting, I thought. So he's trying to fuse. I think he's fusing those two views. And again, I do think it is, like you said, we're just learning more about the cathedral, but it's just as created. It's just as much a work of art as the medievals saw it. But we've kind of moved away from that perception because, as a culture, we no longer really see things as being created, think evolution for that, right? That this is it's just all kind of formless. It's still formless and void, right? Instead of that, it's being created and been shaped. And so we're just expanding on our knowledge of what God has made and how he has made it.
Yeah. So maybe it would be helpful to give us as succinct, sort of clear explanation about the medieval cosmology that Lewis is drawing from as he picks up his pen and begins to write the trilogy. And then we'll get into Donegality, and we'll sort of see how he creates environments in each of the story that are pulling on this medieval cosmology to tell us what he wants to tell us.
Yeah, so the medieval cosmology, obviously you have the form, and then from that certain form, you have certain ideas or theories that come to play. So the form of it is you have the 7 planets in a certain order with Earth at the center, versus our solar centric system. The Earth was at the center, and then that is one thing that I think Lewis talks about quite a bit, and is really important to understand, because we tend to think, they thought Earth was at the center, therefore man is the most important, right? Because we say that all the time, center of your universe, right? You think you're the center of the universe, you're the most important thing. Whereas I think we forget what they thought about the center, right? At the center, if you read Dante's Divine Comedy, center of the earth is actually hell, right? And at the center of hell is Satan. And so they saw the center as being going lower and farther removed from God, right? So the central place that mankind possesses is not one of importance. In fact, it's one of unimportance and humility. We're kind of the basement of the universe, right? We're just kind of tucked away. Which Lewis, in the discard image, he actually says this presented a dissonance between their cosmology and the Christian faith, because the Christian faith grants an importance to mankind. We're created in the image of God. Christ came and took on human flesh, and so there is actually a cognitive dissonance between but we're the sump pump of the galaxy, yet we're also important and have this dignity. So that is a thing that Lewis I think addresses in an important way throughout the trilogy. But so Earth is center. You have these planets kind of arranged moving outwards. Everything above the moon, so the moon is the next planet outside of Earth, is unfallen, unaffected by the results of sin and the fall. And everything below the moon, then the sublunar realm, is affected by decay and breaks down the effects of the fall. And then the other important element that Lewis draws on a lot is that the planets are governed by planetary beings, or I think he would say angelic beings. The medievals saw them as being personalities, right? They're not just these balls of rock in the sky, but they actually have personalities and all of these elements that are associated with them. And because they're unfallen, their influence of their personalities affects the earth. So we get things like, people, we have all sorts of words that we still have from this. People born under, a certain planet have certain personality, like the word jovial, right? Yes. Comes from Jove. And Lewis himself claimed to have been born under Jove, though I think he just really wanted to have been born under Jove, but yes. So we still have remnants of this in how we talk. And so that's another element that he loved. And I think Dr. Michael Ward, who wrote Planet Narnia, he, I think, expertly shows how Lewis drew on that idea for the Narnia stories, which is more of a subtle thing there, whereas I think it's just kind of coming out front and center in the Ransom trilogy, because he's not even trying to hide it, really. It's coming out all over the place. So that arrangement is the physical layout of the cosmos, but then obviously there's all sorts of other elements that the medievals believed in when it came to beings that fill those different spheres of the cosmos, and just how it affects mankind, really, and mankind's place in the universe.
One of the things we discussed when we had Dr. Ward on the program was that in one way, in Narnia, Lewis is almost being the planets himself, because he's showing the kind of the vibes of the planets, if you will, still work on you, because your children are reading Narnia and enjoying it and being charmed by the wizard, as it were. And so he almost, as a kid, he takes on the role, kind of showing the discarded image still has purchase. And I was just thinking the thing you said about very interesting point that yes, the kind of man is at the lowest point of the cosmos is a misunderstanding. One of the things that is fascinating about the Galileo scandal, and I'm sure you realize this given what you just said, but is that a lot of people think that it was sort of scandalous because it made it decentralized man, but it was actually, I guess you've already said that point, but I guess it was also controversial because by shoving the planet, as it were, higher into the spheres, you were overly dignifying man. You were actually kind of making him an angel in a sense by shoving him at the sort of one of the outer layers. So a big theological controversy. But that's a fascinating point. You mentioned the incarnation, and I think that's an interesting theme. One of the most fascinating themes, it seems to me, in the whole trilogy is how the kind of almost if I could put it in Reformed terms, almost the covenant administration of the planetary age epochs changes with the incarnation. That they're kind of all waiting for this God to come onto some planet thing all over the cosmos. Talk to us maybe a little bit about how is Lewis kind of playing with the theme of incarnation, do you think, kind of overall in the series?
Yeah, it's funny, actually. One of the early titles of the book was, before we settled on Deeper Heaven, was Beneath the Eyes of Heaven, which isn't bad. It doesn't, not quite as punchy. So, but part of that idea was that Earth, and this idea comes up again and again throughout the series, but that the eyes of heaven are all fixed on Earth because something happened here that is not just, Lewis, I think, would argue, doesn't just affect mankind, but it completely changed the entire universe, the entire cosmos, because, in a certain point in history, God became man and dwelt among us. And the effects of that are, we become so, I think, numb sometimes to how astounding that is. I mean, especially if you grew up in a Christian family, a Christian home, and you hear it. I mean, obviously it's still impactful, but you start to kind of just take it for granted. Oh yeah. Jesus is God made man, and that's the story. I know the Bethlehem story and the baby in a manger, and I think we do lose sight sometimes of just how extraordinary and earth changing, literally, that really was. And Lewis, and that's why I think Lewis loves fiction, and he loves to instill fiction with these sorts of ideas because it can carry them, right? There's a strength to certain stories that they can carry a lot of meaning and see things in a totally different perspective. So in Paralandra, I love the conversations that Ransom has in Paralandra, because you're seeing Earth and you're seeing the history of mankind from a totally different perspective, this totally foreign and other perspective. And it presents opportunities for discussion you wouldn't ever really have, because you're not going to run into an alien and have to explain to them, about the incarnation and about the crucifixion. But Lewis says, well, what if you did? And what would that conversation look like? And, Ransom has to explain things in a totally different way than he's ever had to explain them before. And so I think that's one of the really impactful elements of the trilogy, is these conversations that put things in a totally new light. They bring life to things that maybe have kind of become dull and commonplace in our lives that really shouldn't be. And so I think that's one of my favorite elements, is the theme of incarnation, and the central importance of the incarnation in the Christian faith and in the history of the world. That this is resurrection glory entering into the middle of human history, and that's hard to overstate the importance of that.
You actually I was just talking to Joe before you joined us. You've got a very fascinating section in the latter part of the book about Gnosticism and incarnationists, or what do you call them? Or incarnationalism.
Incarnational. I don't know. I can't remember
something,
the term.
Right.
I know it was hard to type.
Yeah. Well, that's when you just, as soon as you get the red squiggly line on Word, you just say, remember this one, and then it autofills. So yes, and this is, I think, important, especially in the modern age. If we think of Lewis as a sort of prophet, and I really do look at Lewis as a prophet, looking down to the future on where this is all going in terms of education and how people are interpreting reality. He really did have his finger on the pulse. In Out of the Silent Planet, which the title really shows us a lot about what the story is doing. So you were talking about translunar and sublunar. Under the moon is where the fall has affected everything. And when Divine and Weston capture Ransom and take him beyond the moon, that act is actually violating the seventh law and giving access for deep heaven to come back down into the silent planet. this is just so brilliant. Because then ransom becomes a bridge, and yes. But what is it that reconnection with deeper heaven, how did Lewis understand that? So we were talking about sort of the influence, the personalities of Mars and Venus and Jupiter. How is that cashing out in his storytelling? So I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but I do want to ask, like, in Out of the Silent Planet, where's the emphasis on the personality of whatever planet Lewis is sort of focused on? And then in Paralandra, and then in That Hideous Strength, what is he trying to show those planets having an influence on the sublunar silent planet? And then we'll get into a conversation about how this all really comes together.
Yeah. Well, I think so. It's interesting because the first two books don't take place on Earth. They take place on Mars and Venus, respectively. And the third book stays on Earth, which I think gives it a very different sort of feel or atmosphere. So there are a lot of different ways I think you could look at the influence of the planets and how Lewis utilizes them. What I do in my book is I focus on the character of Ransom, because I think Ransom is really the key to it. So tracing his growth as a character and his role in the different books. So I think the first book, he's on Mars very clearly. I think the whole book is about him becoming marshal primarily. And there's all sorts of language that Lewis uses to really drive this point home. Very subtle, you might not on the surface even notice it, but even just the words that he chooses to describe Ransom's feelings and the ideas that he's having in his head. Even very soon after landing on the planet, he runs away. He manages to escape from Weston and Fine, and he had stolen a knife, and he kind of kept it on him. And the thought occurs to him, he's like, I could actually use this to defend myself. And he's startled by that thought, even just like, I'm not a violent man. He even fought in the war, and he said that wasn't my cup of tea. And so already kind of the air of Mars is working on him, and until he finally he becomes I am trying to find a good translation of Nokra Punt, right, which is the slayer of the Nokra, and with the Harasa, and he becomes actually this, he's joining in with them in this very martial exercise, right? That's not very him. And so I think that's his journey through the first book, which is in turn preparing him for his role in the second book. So it's all building, where in the second book, his ultimate test of his, you could say martiality, is that even a word?
Yes.
I'm making it up.
You can make it up.
Yes. He made up donegality, so you can make up martiality. There you go.
Yes.
That was Dr. Ward made that one up. So
right. Yes.
I just stole it from him.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
He slays the unman, right? In the end of, by the way, no spoilers when you're having this sort of discussion. I suppose.
Oh, no spoilers.
They've been out long enough. Hopefully you've read the books. Yeah.
Yes, and if you haven't, shame on you. You deserve the spoiler.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. I tell my 8th grade English students, I said, there's no such thing as a spoiler in literature class, really, because we got to talk about the whole thing, really.
That's right.
So, so that is kind of the culmination, I think, of the martial spirit that he was learning on Mars. But then I argue that he's prophet, priest, and king, right? Like he's an image of Christ, right? He's displaying all those elements, obviously in miniature. And so in Paralandra, he has the role of prophet very clearly, because he's sent there by angelic beings for a specific job. He's trusting that he'll know what to do and what to say when the time comes, which is a very prophetic kind of thing, right? The prophets are always just given the appropriate words at the right moment. And then finally in That Hideous Strength, he's described in very, very kingly imagery. He's likened to King Arthur and to Solomon, and he only eats bread and wine. That's his diet, which is a very, kind of, and he performs a priestly function in bringing Jane and Mark back back together. And so all of those elements make him a very, very strong Christ figure throughout. And they are also, though, influenced by the planet that he's on, and I think guided in that way as well. I'm not claiming full credit for that idea. I fleshed it out a little more, but Dr. Ward does talk about some of those elements in Planet Narnia. So, so he kind of was the inspiration, and then I'm like, okay, I want to dig even more deeply into this and see what I can pull out here. So,
it'd be worth. One of the things that you make some fascinating comments on is the relationship between Mark and Jane in That Hideous Strength, and that there's a almost you could see that. I mean, the whole series, sort of climaxes in this love scene, really. I mean, that's and it's the sort of the Martial element and the Venus element sort of coming together in man and woman. But you make a very interesting comment about how, in one sense, Lewis in That Hideous Strength is portraying, as your book points out, there's all of a sudden several female characters. Female characters have not been particularly prominent in the first two books, but in the third book, there's several types of women, as it were. And Mark and Jane are clearly sort of your young bougie urban professionals. Lewis is writing about very modern people. This is a relationship we've all seen a million times. And this is something Lewis is always trying to do, is actually imagine, in a sense, how a modern person in a modern world with, in a way, the kind of architecture of modern life can nevertheless appropriate the old ways and with the discarded image, but also with gender. And so it's interesting, you make this point that she finds her redemption at the moment she learns a certain submissiveness. She learns a spirit of, she takes on a different spirit that's more biblical and sort of against the kind of all the vibes that everybody's telling her that she needs to be as a woman. But he, on the other hand, is redeemed when he learns, in a sense, not to go with the flow. It's actually not just being the professional who gives into all the okay, I'll just do the thing so everybody's happy with me and, I'm making my thing. But it's actually when he says, no, I actually need to be against something and fight a battle. That's actually when he sort of is redeemed in his manhood. And I thought that was very insightful. Maybe talk, maybe how does gender, what's Lewis's interest, as it were, in gender in the whole thing, or maybe if you want to say about That Hideous Strength specifically.
Well, it's a fascinating theme. And honestly, I could have probably done more on it in the book, but time and space, time and space. If I had but world enough and time, right?
Yes.
But that's always what we say. But I wanted to focus particularly on it in That Hideous Strength, because I do think it is one of the primary themes in that book, directly relating to the fact that in That Hideous Strength, the NICE, the NICE, right? They are wanting to recreate humanity. And they want to be into control, total control. And what that essentially looks like ends up being a wiping out of humanity, really, right? So they want to remake it, but remake it in a non-organic, non-binary, right? They don't want male, female. They don't want all the messiness of creation, right? Organic matter. They want it all to be like metal trees and metal flowers, right? And just sterile all the way down. And
the Lorax.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the Lorax, right.
Yeah. So I think that's why it comes out, you contrast that with St. Anne's, right? This group of kind of ragtag bunch of mostly women. Actually, I think the women slightly outnumber the men in St. Anne's. And then you have, a bear, Mr. Bultitude, and mice and birds. And it's just very, very homely and very, very organic, right? You can actually, when you read about it, it's like, you know what it smells like when you walk into the kitchen, right? There's someone smoking a pipe over there, and they're making dinner, and the men have to do the washing up. And it's just very, very homely and normal. And that is what they are fighting to preserve, though, is that just that men and women living simple, ordinary lives, the way they're meant to. And so I think Lewis, again, that's why that the roles of the genders really comes out in that his strength. It's not a very popular topic today. So I, in writing those chapters, I was writing them like, wow, I could make some people really mad with what I'm saying, but oh well, let's just go for it. So I think, again, and then the headship and submission, again, is not a kind of a hot button topic, but that is what Lewis is addressing with Mark and Jane. And what's fascinating, though, I think is really important to note, is that Jane is meant to submit to her own husband, right? There's the scene that's really crucial where she's tempted to submit to Ransom. She's like, he's amazing. She has kind of an awe of him, and is tempted to just give in. And he said, you ought not, you may not, right? I'm not the one. But Mark, he's so much harder to submit to, right? He's a lot of, he's a piece of work himself.
Kind of a loser. I mean,
and so they both have to wrestle with the fact that they're not necessarily married to someone who makes it easy for them to do that. And yet they're married to that person. And so they have to work with that. And it's just, so I think it's very fascinating, their journeys and their different temptations that I think Lewis is saying are fair. I mean, they're unique to those characters, but they're also fairly standard as far as gender goes, right? Women generally do struggle. They're meant to submit to their own husbands, and that's a struggle because we're fallen, we're sinful, and we were told, and Eve was told that that's part of that original curse, and men are called to lead and to sacrifice themselves for their wives as Christ did for the church. And that's hard. It's difficult to do in a fallen, sinful world. And so Mark and Jane are both tempted to abandon those callings. They do have some specific personality quirks, right? Mark's desire to always be accepted and to be inside and to be seen as being in the inside and in the know. I think there are definitely people, men and women, who relate to that temptation, right? You want to be, even if you're not part of the cool kids, you want to be seen as being part of the cool kids, right? It's not actually about being with those people. It's about being seen to be with those people. And then Jane, she just wants to be in her ivory tower doing her really boring studies on John Donne and writing her research that no one will care to read. And that's okay, though, because it's just her and her academic utopia, right? By herself, left alone with no messiness of dealing with other people. And both of them have to sacrifice that. And really, because it comes down to their pride in the wrong things. Right. And so they both have to wrestle with that and ultimately sacrifice it.
Right.
I think that Joe and I were also talking about this before you joined us.
Little prophets here. We talk about everything before.
No, we're talking about the same book.
Yeah.
But yes. So I think that precisely, Christiana, in the modern age, the temptation, I think, is to sort of tiptoe around the modern landmines of controversial subjects that could cancel us, that could get us in hot water with the wrong people. And we have social media and worldwide connection and all of these things. And your name could be maligned quickly. And if you rely on your name to put bread on the table for the family, that becomes a problem. But Lewis is much bigger than this. I think what Lewis is doing is saying, okay, we're moving into modernity. There are real problems here. And I'm trying to figure them out along with everyone else. But nevertheless, if we can zoom out, if we could zoom way out, and you can get out of the current political sort of dilemma that you find yourself in and think about Jupiter, then all of your little pettiness here on the silent planet would be humbled under the weight of the cosmos. So simultaneously, humanity is extremely important because we're made in the image of God. But we also hold the lowliest position in the cosmological order. And so there's a sense of dignity and respect and pride even pride above the angels that long and desire to look into the miracle of God doing something to us. But there's also the humility of being the lowest in the cosmological order. And so when we encounter the sort of current cultural phenomena, we can rise above the general discourse and say, oh, God is much bigger than like pronouns. Now they are important, and we should invest into whatever we're given in God's providence to deal with, like sages. We need a nation of sages, as Lewis talks about in Miracles. But he's a good orienting character for liberals or for progressives and conservatives alike, because he really does draw you outside of the stream of the constant bombardment on social media about all of the next hot topic items.
I'm sorry, Dale, go ahead.
No, well, I was going to say that's not a question. It's more of a comment, but it's sort of like reinforcing what you're saying and to say, I think one of the functions of recovering the discarded image and really digging deeply into the Ransom trilogy is to do precisely that, to get outside of your own little bubble of consciousness, to think broader, because God is big and he's done a bunch of stuff with all of these little lights in the sky. So I agree 100%. That's all. That is more of a comment. But
okay. I was going to say, one of the things on what you were just saying, Christiana, is that Christiana, I got it wrong. Darn it!
You made it a while.
I made it a while. 45 minutes. I mean, we're feeling good about that, actually.
Right.
Part of what Lewis, of course, is doing in his project is sort of tucking away controversial things in innocent literature that is interesting in its own right. And one of the things, very often you throw out a word like submission or something like this, and it's such a trigger word, and we've all inherited it. And kind of in the context of the culture wars, Lewis is partly writing before that, but he's also writing, and I found this striking as I was reading both Perelandra, preparing for this. If you can imagine this, I had never read Perelandra. I'd read the other two, but I'd never read Perelandra. So, and of course, there's so much about gender in there and in the third book, but it's so attractive. I would dare say that even a modern person who's been trained, it would be difficult, in fact, to be a modern person, even if you've been trained in public school and have had gender ideology shoved down your throat. If you just stop for a second and read these books, I think it would actually be hard for a very human part of you not to feel a little bit of magic working on you, because the way he portrays it is really it's not a polemic. It really is the goodness, the organism itself, the shining beauty of the organism itself. And Lewis is no stranger to the complexity of gender, which he writes about in the Four Loves, and of course in his own relationship with Joy, there was a weird symmetry, there, and in the character of Orwell, of course, in Till We Have Faces, is a very complicated. He writes a very complicated woman well. Yes. I gather, though, I believe that it's widely whispered that Joy helped him a little bit get the details right. But fascinating. Maybe one way of sort of gesturing toward a close here would be to talk about, what do we do with this? On the one hand, again, the paradox of Lewis is sort of, isn't this cosmology fascinating? And yet also, the medieval cosmology is in one sense, quote, quote, wrong on a certain register, at least. And yet we talk a lot about things like re-enchantment these days. We're all disenchanted. We don't see the world as created. And sometimes we think of it as just, memorize these things, and then we'll look at the world as enchanted. And yet enchantment is as Dale and I've talked about this a bunch of times, it seems to me is mostly about us. We need to become re-enchanted. It's not the universe is as enchanted as it's ever been. It's we who are atrophied. And I wonder if you could maybe say a few words, and I think you do to helpful words toward the end of this book. If you could say a few words about what do you think it might mean to look like for ourselves, not the world, but for ourselves to be more kind of reattuned to the livingness of things, to the createdness of things. Yeah. What does that look like?
I think obviously as a teacher, one huge element is education and teaching, and teaching, not just education in the sense of telling a student, this is cool, right?
Yes.
You should like this. But I and obviously there's a time and place for that.
You gotta shove things down the throat every now and again. Yeah, that's right.
But obviously that does start with the teacher, right? If the teacher is excited and interested, you can make students interested, and you can make something interesting. And trying to be copious and connect things, right? That students love that. I teach junior high and high school, which is a fun age. Junior high especially is great fun. Yeah. But they love connections, right? They already love discovering that what they learned over in this class actually has something to do with what you're talking about now in this class. And so obviously part of that, you have to have a teacher that's able to do that. And so being a teacher who is constantly learning and reading and being able to utilize that. But so classroom, I think it's a lot of it starts in the classroom when kids are young, or if you're a parent with your own kids, is, noticing things, just looking around, looking outside. And so on that note, I think I say at the end of the book, go outside. When's the last time you actually went stargazing? Most people probably haven't done it in a while. And just the immensity, the magnitude of God's creation, and how, it's hard to look out at a night sky full of stars and not be in awe and amazed by that. And having that in holding that in one hand and holding an education in the other hand, where you've read what other men have said about the stars. So when you look up at the night sky, it's not only what's in front of your eyes, but it's what's behind your eyes. It's what you've read. It's what other men have said throughout the history of the entire world about the stars, memorizing scripture, right? Internalizing the word of God, and what comes out, right? We have many, many words in the Bible of what people say when they look up at the sky, right? The heavens declare your glory, right? And so if that's dwelling in us richly, it will come out. So the word of God and the created word of God, which, we know the creation is God's words in incarnate, right? He spoke everything in being. And so those two things together, the word of God on the page and the word of God in creation, I think holding those together is really, really important. And so that is one thing that I think that will help to reawaken just seeing what God has done everywhere we look. Right? There's no place you can look and not see something that tells you something about the way God is.
Yeah, it's almost like chipping the crust off of your imagination. That modernity is sort of settled on and, like Joe said, atrophied. And when we talked with Dr. Ward the first time about Planet Narnia, he's the one who actually attuned me to this. There are actually, over in the UK anyway, there are these dark spaces now. They're called dark spaces, where people are like flocking to the country without ambient light just to look at the stars. And I don't think that these are, I'm sure there are religious people involved with it, but I think that there's just, this is the Tao. This is the music of the spheres calling to us as image bearers, begging us to look at the beauty that we already have sort of intrinsic. But this is the last thing I'll ask you, Christiana. So you're a classical educator. I'm sure you've read David Hicks' book, Norms and Nobility.
I think so. It might have been a while, but
it's probably been a while. It was published like back in the 80s, and then there was a bunch of other editions.
Yeah. Sounds familiar.
Yes, very, very good book. And what he talks about is the relationship between mythos and logos. So he really does get into, and you do at the end of the book. There is something, as Joe is saying, to the fact that the medieval cosmology is factually untrue, but the mythos can carry the weight of truth more so than actual facts in some cases. And this is what Lewis was very concerned about. And I think the Bible does this at times. Like the Bible actually carries us along, an axe head floating on the water, physically impossible. According to every scientific test that we run, we wouldn't replicate this. And I think Christianity will say, well, it was a miracle. And that may be true, but part of understanding what's going on when God tells us that is that he is really using a sort of mythos to explain reality in a way that only myth can. So how should, especially in the modern age, especially for younger generations that are growing up, how should we balance this tension between sort of storytelling myths and then facts and logic? What is the relationship, and how do they synthesize, or how do they complement one another? Because they're not doing the same thing, but they're gesturing towards the telos.
You're trying to relate Joseph Campbell and Ben Shapiro. There you go.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Perfect, Joe.
Oh, yes. Well, I think one thing to note at the start is that I think myth is a part of who we are as human beings, and you can't really escape it. I do think it's an inescapable concept. You're going to have myth. Are you going to have, the myth of, there was this big bang that caused all the goo to become all the things, right? I mean, evolution is a myth, really. And you have also, everyone's going to have certain myths that are prominent in their lives. And I think that Lewis talks about, and I talk about this in Deeper Heaven, is the difference between true myth and false myth, right? You can actually have true and false myth, which is kind of a strange idea to us, because we tend to just use the word myth to mean, it's false, it's automatically false. And that's not what myth, though, in the sense that Lewis uses it, actually means. So myth is very prominent. I think it's part of how we operate. Myths speak to us. And actually, I was just reading today. I was getting ready to write an article, and I was reading Lewis's Experiment in Criticism, and he actually talks about, which is an excellent. Yeah, it's really, really good. There's a lot of gems in that, and there's a section where he's talking about myth. And he says something interesting about not all myths will actually speak to different people as myths, right? So there's an element in which the way we receive something as a myth, kind of bestows this sort of myth status on it, which is really interesting, a fascinating way of looking at it. That one person could read this account or this story, and it carries this weight of truth in it that speaks to them in a way that is beyond just a good story, but it actually sticks with them, and it has achieved myth status, right? Because it has communicated something about reality to them in such a way that sticks with them and changes them. I think that everyone has something like that. I think if you ask anyone, like, what's a story that has significantly changed the way you view the world, I think we'd all have something like that. And even some of them maybe are very silly and don't seem like myths at all. Yes. But so I think, again, it's not whether you will have a presence of myth in your life. It's what kind of myths will they be? And so surrounding yourself with true myths, with myths that tell the truth, again, about the way the world is. And those are the ones that are the most impactful. Lewis himself those sorts of the tropes, right, of the dying god metaphor, trope throughout different mythological stories, and all of these elements that he just loved were beautiful to him. They were enchanting to him, and he was always bemoaning the fact that but they're not true, right? They're not real. They didn't really happen. And it was that conversation about that with Tolkien and other friends that he realized there's something going on here beyond them just being false stories of things that didn't really happen. There is a truth down at the center of them. And so I think reading widely and well and being, shaped and formed by the right kinds of stories is a huge, is important, because you're going to be told stories. You're going to be shaped by those stories. So which ones are they going to be? Right. And that's, I think, and obviously comes down again, because I'm a teacher, it's education, right? So it does that. That's come. I come to back to that a lot. I don't have kids, right? I'm not married. I don't have kids right now, but I have 120 that I see every day. So,
yes, absolutely.
I have lots of children that and so surrounding them with good stories. And the thing is, if you're trained in good stories, you're going to have an eye to the bad ones. You're going to things are going to ring false. And you're going to notice that. And you're going to know that robins are good birds, and you can trust them to follow them into the woods, and they'll lead you to the beaver, right? Who will then lead you to Aslan. Yeah. So being trained, right? Having training ground in good story and good myth and true myth is going to make you more sensitive to the false ones.
Right. Yeah. Right. Well, that's a great note, I think, to close on. I think that's a great note to close on. And just as as an advertisement out there, I think this book, if you were, if you were homeschooling or you're teaching a college course or anything like that, or have a high school or junior high course and you're working through Lewis's trilogy, I think this is actually a very good, it functions honestly as a good textbook. It's very convenient for students and draws a lot of the literary connections and that sort of thing to Dante and to various sources that most of us wouldn't know, because we're not C.S. Lewis, but Christiana Hale teaches this and knows these sources. And it's it's very helpful, and I think very accessible. I think a good accomplishment. Well, you can find us on Facebook. YouTube, our SoundCloud channel, where we hit all the, what do you call those, Dale? The podcast catchers, something like that. Look on the media and you'll find the Pilgrim Faith Podcast. That's what I'm trying to say. Normally Dale does the ending and he knows all the things to say. But Christiana, thanks so much for being with us. It was great to have you. And you're welcome. This was I really love it. Any excuse to just talk about Lewis, I'll take.
Yes.
Well, we're always game for that.
And when you crank your next book out, we'll have you back on.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. It might be a little while, but
no worries.
Take your time.
We'll still be here. All right.
Yes.
All right. Well, goodbye, everybody.
Take care.